Well, good afternoon, and before I get started, I also want to echo the thanks to the organizers for putting this conference on. I think it's a really great idea, and it's been a lot of fun so far, and looking forward to tomorrow as well. My name is Joshua Shake from the University of Michigan, a doctoral student, as I was introduced, and going to keep with the theme of urban renewal and present one of those little. And I think we all have had that experience where you're researching one thing, and then this unexpected little morsel kind of pops up in the research. So I'm going to present one of those little morsels that came out of a larger research, my dissertation research project today. So one of the greatest contradictions and continuing contradictions in urban planning today is between the kind of urban planning theory of practice that emphasizes community involvement and participatory planning, especially in the case of Brazil, or at least in Brazil's example, and the continued influence of sometimes contradictory public policies and financial structures that in many cases result in mimicry, copying, and even plagiarism of urban design and architectural features around, as visible around the world. So in this, I should say death there. So in this presentation, I argue that a different kind of flow, not or beyond those of just public policy and financial flows, actually the translation of Jane Jacobs' seminal work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, into Brazilian Portuguese in the early 2000s has actually influenced city builders in São Paulo, but in doing so ignores some of the most essential elements of her theories. So kind of expanding out what we know about policy and idea flows, it's received a lot of, phenomena have received a lot of attention in geography and urban planning literatures recently, most notably among the ideas of policy tourism, where cities will put on basically seminars and invite city officials from other cities to come and visit, learn about their projects. You can think of the case of Bilbao, Spain, and the Guggenheim design, or the Frank Gehry designed Guggenheim Museum there, and the subsequent kind of Bilbao effect that took hold. Cities also, there's also the growing influence or continued influence of international financing bodies like the World Bank and United Nations that have some power and influence over the way projects are financed, and almost results in cities taking the path of least resistance. Okay, City X built this kind of project. It worked out, the numbers worked out, so that may work for us, rather than kind of pushing the envelope, so to speak. You see same phenomena with NGOs, and especially since they operate oftentimes on even shorter financing cycles. And the growing and powerful influence of multinational architectural and design firms that operate across continents, have offices on 5 or 6 of the continents. And kind of intertwined with all these are the idea of best practices. So in the United Nations, World Bank, all those bodies, Inter-American Development Bank, even like national level bodies promote the idea of urban planning best practices. Well, Curitiba built a BRT system, so BRT is the best thing for every other city. Well, it may or may not, and there may be specific factors that, in the case of Curitiba, made it work there that may not allow it to work in your city. So switching gears to Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's one of the most seminal works in urban planning and urban design literature in the United States. It was first published in 1961 in response to the high modernist urban renewal, if you know urban planning history in the U.S., spearheaded by Robert Moses in New York City. And it was her kind of response to the high modernist urban planning and urban renewal that was taking place at the time, and looking at basically her neighborhood in New York and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and why the high modernist style urban planning wouldn't work, or it shouldn't work, and it doesn't work. So she divides the book into 4 parts, and I won't go into a deep summary of the book, but part 1, she talks about the nature of cities, and this is where she really explores the uses of sidewalks, parks, and neighborhoods, and views those as some of the essential elements for neighborhood vitality, and sidewalks allowing for people to interact and children to play, what makes parks work and parks not work. Some of the high modernist parks that were being built in New York that she saw were really kind of just closed off from people using them, and specifics of park size and the park layout that promoted people using the parks and promoted safety in the parks, and kind of expanded those out to neighborhoods as a whole. In the discussion of neighborhoods, she looked at conditions for diversity, and this is a main thing that has really been picked up in urban planning thought and influenced urban planning since. Mixed uses, small blocks to allow for walkability, which contradicts directly the high modernist style urban design. Aged buildings, or kind of a diversity of buildings, new buildings, old buildings, historic preservation, but also new construction isn't out of the question, and a certain level of density that contradicts, again, the modernist style planning where you had the tower in the park style. A density, but a density on the ground, and a density of uses, and mixed and different uses where people would interact on the street. The shopkeeper interacts with the mom who's taking her kids to school, and then later on, you may have the corner bar. And that has kind of influenced, she never says it in the book, but you may be familiar with the idea of eyes on the street. That's basically attributed to Jane Jacobs, but ironically, she never says eyes on the street, but it emerges from those ideas. And then also goes in to discuss forces of decline and regeneration in cities, and different tactics that may overcome the issues of the Robert Moses style urban planning. So that's a long way from Brazil. So doing some research, discovered that, at least to the best of my knowledge, Death and Life of Great American Cities was only translated in Portuguese in the year 2000. So what does that mean? In my completely unscientific data analysis, and I looked at, I used Google Scholar search results just because it's the most comprehensive that I could find and be able to separate search results by language. So it's kind of a convoluted chart, but basically the top half are any Google Scholar citation that is in Portuguese. So I break it up to citations that are based on just searching for the title, or specifically citations in the bibliography for the English version of the book, the Portuguese version of the book, and then kind of totaled those up. And there's a couple different columns based on by time period and the total results, and I think that's just a little data error in the unscientific data. And then I compare those numbers, just easy little straightforward comparison to results in all languages. Again, splitting it apart from a search based on the title of the book and a search based on citations. So, I mean, I didn't regress the numbers, I didn't look for significance or anything, but there is a much higher uptick after the book was published in 2000 in Portuguese language citations versus all citations. And it does show that Jane Jacobs has kind of received more attention recently throughout the world, but a significant uptick in Portuguese. So again, going back to this larger research project, I'm doing research on the series of redevelopment projects in the central region of the city and of São Paulo, the loose region of the city. And there's been a series of projects roughly since 1992 that have kind of employed the grab bag of urban renewal types of ideas. And went through kind of traditional financial incentives to try to incentivize private sector investment, kind of went through a culture-led redevelopment phase where you saw the renovation of some of the museums and the creation of Sala São Paulo under the Covas administration. And then under the Kasabi, I guess it was born under Serra's brief tenure as mayor, but really Kasabi pushed it forward. The emergence of a completely new, unknown urban redevelopment mechanism, at least unknown in the case of Brazil, that really tried to emphasize public-private partnership, but provided for some interesting involvement from the private sector. So public-private partnership, you have the city works in conjunction with the private sector to construct things, but this project, the Nova Luz project, actually had those partnerships even during the design phases. So a consortium of design firms, AECOM, which is one of those multinational design firms, and two Brazilian firms did the entire design for a 45-block area, and down to street trees and the type of sidewalk paving in the area here illustrated in the map. So just for size, yeah, it's a 45-block area. I think, and their plans were to basically destroy about 50% of the blocks and rebuild from the ground up. In other cases, there was historic preservation and other things going on. Not to get into too much detail, there also was public housing to be completed. Well, I guess that's important. Public housing was to be completed. It was the first ever attempt at public housing in a central region of the city using the special interest zoning called ZEIS, Zonas de Especial Interesse Social, and really first ever concerted attempt to build public housing in the central part of the city, and it would have occupied about 11 blocks of this region. Needless to say, with the elections last year, things got shifted around. Project is basically thrown away. Saw yesterday, Nabil is trying to put forth a new regulation, or a regulation in the city of São Paulo that will completely get rid of the specific urban planning mechanism that was used in this case. But some of the things kind of continue. The public-private partnerships are still being used by the present administration, and the mixed income, mixed use components are still there. So they're still trying to build public housing, but it's mixed income public housing. So in doing this, this research, I interviewed upper-level city officials last summer, North American summer, and folks involved with the design consortium. And they emphasized creating a Jane Jacobs neighborhood, and basically, or straight up said, we really want to build a Jane Jacobs neighborhood. And get kind of inspired by the eyes on the street. And so it was like buzzwords from Jane Jacobs came out in the interviews with people from both sides. And I found that really interesting. And kind of thought about it more, and and kind of discussions, and the more I read, the more I progressed in my own research, really saw some interesting contradictions. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that Jane Jacobs really calls for contextual sensitivity and understanding the people that make up the city, and taking it from the days that the city was going to be a machine under the high modernist style. She was really calling for understanding the city, building the city for the people, the human element. And ironically, I argue that that was missing in the Nova Luz project, in the design. Despite trying to use the good design ideas from Jane Jacobs, they were missing a lot of the Brazilian context issues, issues of socio-spatial, fun word to say, inequality. Brazil has no tradition, to the best of my knowledge, of building mixed income housing, especially like in the same building. And beyond the social conditions, the Brazilian housing market doesn't produce those types of that type of housing, and doesn't produce mixed-use housing. And informal surveys, I think the most recent real mixed-use housing with ground floor commercial and residential above were built in the 60s or 70s. Kind of wrap things up. I kind of sped through there at the end, but we'll open it up for questions. So yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, the spread and growth of Jane Jacobs' influence in Brazil following her publication of Portuguese in 2000 had inspired the design elements in Nova Luz, but the contextuality and social issues complicate some of the major elements of the previous attempt and the critical elements of the new redevelopment program for that region, and those ironically ignore Jane Jacobs' call for the contextual sensitivity, which was the crux of her argument. Thank you.